we go. Okay, never mind. Okay, sorry. So part of the impetus behind the lecture was really actually to follow up on some of my observations from the studio work that I saw. And so this was the studio, the Musée Imaginaire studio. And in my initial musings with Elena on the topic last fall, I shared some ideas for how I thought Malraux and his treatise from 1947 could be brought into our present thinking about museums. It's important to realize that, first of all, that it was written in a post-war European context where a lot of Europe had basically been decimated. So he was essentially looking out the window at a kind of tabula rasa. What he was lucky, of course, was that Paris had not been materially largely affected because of the war. But nonetheless, I think that had something to do with his rethinking of culture and how to present cultural artifacts. And in this context, he tried to formulate a new museum type. You could call that type actually an a-typology. It was one that front-loaded what he called a kind of new field of investigation and engagement, one which centralized the role of reproductions in generating new museological paradigms. And so for him, the development of photographic techniques was especially important because these tools of documentation could play a really important role in expanding or democratizing the viewing of art. And so he really saw that tool as a kind of revolutionary tool that curators and people who were thinking about art and talking about art could mobilize to their advantage. So given the reproducibility of negative-based images, the use of photography was especially important for Malraux in documenting three-dimensional objects. But of course, he used them, as you can see in this image, he used them to photograph paintings as well. But you can imagine, given the site specificity and the fact that, for example, buildings don't move and large sculptures don't move very easily, that photography in documenting three-dimensional objects, so sculpture, statuary, architecture, really opened up a new kind of institutional model for viewing.
I think we're not.
Hey,
Jasmine, I think that you're still on the cover image. Sorry to interrupt you. You're on the cover page. I'm not sure if you're going through slides.
I am. It's not working.
Yeah,
So,
it's not working.
No, we're only. Yeah, we're just seeing the cover image. Yeah.
Shoot.
I think maybe if you go full screen, you have to share a different screen on PDF.
So can you see it this way?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Maybe
so
we
were in this image.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to go. So if I go full screen mode.
No, we don't see the full screen. Yeah, we are still. If you check on the new share, it might be the full. Yeah, you don't see the full screen mode.
You don't see it. Okay. So we'll have to just do it this way then.
If you want, you can. Yes, yeah, you can just close the right side, bar of content if you want to, and then that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. I was wondering. Okay. Here I am going off on my own tangent. All right. So here we have Malraux with his photographs of paintings and photographs of sculptures and photographs of statues in his apartment in Paris. And he started constructing this idea of the Musée Imaginaire in his apartment, looking at these photographs. So as I said, the documentation of three-dimensional objects in particular for him was important because it opened up a new institutional model for viewing. One where portable and immovable objects alike could be presented together. So what that offered was a creation of a kind of visual, if not spatial, continuum. Certainly not a historical one, but a kind of a continuum that allowed for a kind of narrative to be overwritten onto a series of objects or a series of images. One of the tragedies, I guess, of the English translation of Malraux, which is why so happy that Elena kept the Musée Imaginaire, is that the English translation of Musée Imaginaire is museum without walls, which is a really tragic translation, I think, because it really kind of invokes a really extremely reductive understanding of museums. And it doesn't help us as architects to really understand and to adopt and adapt Malraux to our thinking. And what I prefer much more is to continue to use the word imaginary, in fact, because I think the imaginary doesn't reduce us into thinking that we can only think about no wall.
But we can't hear her.
You can't hear me? Can you not hear me?
We can hear you, I think.
I can hear you, yes, we can hear.
I think that was as an audio.
Yeah, I can hear you too.
Okay, all right. So buildings obviously need some kind of enclosure. So the better question seems to be, in my view, what way can new technologies that have been forged since the advent of photography kind of further destabilize our normative conceptions of museums? And so this lecture in part leans in on the notion of the imaginary, which I hope is more expansive and gives you a more sort of multidisciplinary understanding of the word. And I'm going to look at architects, but also critics, writers, and filmmakers, because film is one of those sort of media which I think can be especially fruitful to students as they're developing their projects and thinking about film as a kind of design tool. So the current COVID state of lockdown has inspired others, not just us, but others to rethink the cultural importance of museums. And while curators of these cultural institutions grapple with this new reality, i.e. no visitors allowed, the others have been sort of wondering about what happens when we don't have that refuge of art viewing, because art and viewing of it has always been offered up as a refuge in crisis. So what happens when the refuge itself goes dark? So now we have not only no touching, but we have no looking or no seeing. And the writer Andrea Scott, it's not actually Rachel Cohen, she's talked about this idea of missing the museum. And for her, what she was missing was that sort of physical interaction with a particular painting by Poussin from 1658, Blind Orion Searching for the Rising Sun. And she tried to articulate in her piece in New Yorker, her feeling of loss for not being able to revisit it, not being able to see it in real life anymore. And she never used to take photographs in her museum visits, but ever since she left New York, she started taking photographs of them. And she realized that in this moment of sort of cultural anxiety and disembodiment, she decided she was going to try to make a personal, quote, remembered museum. And she called this remembered museum the Frederick Project, which is based on, this is for you, Elena, based on an Italian children's story about Frederick the Mouse, who, by Leone, who talks about this mouse who sort of looks very idle during the summer while the other mice are storing grain. Frederick stores up impressions of colors. And so here it is in the thought bubble, the impressions of colors. And what he does in the winter, when all his friends are huddled and waiting for the summer to come again, he tries to share what he can of the colors he remembers. And so this is that image of Leone, of Frederick sharing memories of colors. Anyway, so this project every day has been a kind of diary for Cohen, and every day she uses a new photograph of a painting that she took at a museum to sort of revisit that work of art. And I think for her, it's been a kind of fruitful way of kind of reimagining what it would be to be back in a museum. There have been other writers like the art critic Peter Sheldal, also an article in the New Yorker, who is really dismayed at sort of current efforts of museums to try to provide virtual tours. He finds it a kind of adding of insult to injury, that this is strictly spectacular, amorphous, disembodied, aesthetic experience. And so he continues on to say this is completely inaccessible and basically unacceptable for him. That the works for him conjure in an imagination, in the imagination, so here's the word again, a significance that we have taken for granted. And so he didn't realize that until he couldn't go see his favorite paintings again. So for him, this period of confinement made him think about his last visit to Madrid, and where he saw Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas painting. And he talks about his visit. He's recalling it, the memory of his visit. And he says, you know, now there has been a change in my memory of it. And that the shift has gone from exhilaration to melancholy. Now the painting is really interesting. I'm not going to go through it, but it's very architectural, and it's actually a project that was used when I was a student. I had Michael Webb was one of my instructors, and he made us do a floor plan of this painting. So, you know, here I have this archigram guy telling me, okay, look at this painting and do the floor plan of it. So because it evokes kind of this mise en abîme, spaces within spaces, and there's a kind of sense of mystery about it, to me, it struck a chord that Schlegel, of all the paintings that he was sort of rethinking in this period, was Las Meninas. So, you know, I think there were many responses in the litter box to Schlegel's essay. What are we going to do once again when we're free to wander museums? Somebody said, you know, this reminded them of what Holden Caulfield in J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye said about the Museum of Natural History in New York. These are images of the Museum of Natural History. Caulfield recalls that everything always stayed right where it was. Nobody moved, nobody would be different. The only thing that would be different would be you. And that this static environment was somehow a kind of comfort to Holden as the rest of his life was evading control. And we'll get back to this building in a minute. Others were disappointed in this reading. They thought it was very retrograde of Schlegel to sort of react, and very reactionary of him. That rather than regarding virtual experiences of artwork as amorphous disembodiments of aesthetic experience, maybe the idea that great art can only be truly appreciated in a museum alienates those who, even in non-pandemic times, are unable to visit cultural institutions. So it implied that such groups then could not have full aesthetic experiences, and by extension, they could not develop artistic taste. And so in effect, I think that also, again, that response, the latter response, mirrors Malraux's vision of a new museum, his foreshadowing of it. Are we not forced now to resolve the problems of accessibility that many of us have been advocating for decades, but been kind of putting off? And so in a way, the virtual museum may be a monumental step towards greater cultural accessibility, something that advocates have been trying for a while to achieve, as I said. This is an example from the Autry Museum of the American West that started an archive called History is Being Made Now in response to the COVID pandemic, asking artists to submit portraits of themselves in isolation. So these are a series of COVID portraits by artists. But even before the pandemic, at a conference entitled Making a Museum in the 21st Century, the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Glenn Lowry, remarked that a museum is not a building, it's not a collection, it's not the people who go there, it's an idea. And I think his observation underscores a growing consensus among museum directors, but maybe also architects, who are really aiming to productively disrupt and rethink the possibilities of museum making today. I think Peter Zumthor also could not have imagined a pandemic when he referred to the new LACMA as a sanctuary for homeless objects. Architecture's role in rehousing of the 135,000, what he called disparate objects in this kind of non-linear way. Architecture's job was to create a context where there was none. And so his vision of the museum as a site of refuge also made me think of Malraux. and how we can harness this word imaginary and leverage it so that when buildings reopen or when we design new buildings, we can nimbly adjust to changing conditions of siting and programming. So just a quick historic foray. This is probably a good point just to step back for a moment and recall briefly maybe the lineage and the origins of the modern museum. Where have we been? Where do we come from? The root of the word museum is literally where the muse lies. So where did the muse lie before it had walls that we now know as a museum? These are examples of cabinets of curiosities, so Imperiatos della Storia Naturale in around 1600 on the left, and then a newer version of a cabinet of curiosities by Mark Dion for the Weizmann Art Museum from 2006. These eventually started getting scaled up. So for example, if we look at the Pitti Palace, we start to see now a palace, the scale of the palatial rooms, being filled from top to bottom with paintings in heavily gilded frames. And this is the 1900 photograph of the Room of Saturn, and then the Room of Saturn as it exists today. We also had in the 19th century these salons, right? So these Parisian salons where paintings would be for sale. The artists would mingle with potential clients and they would discuss, the merits of their work. But this is really a rarefied societal sphere. This is a very small chunk of society that had access to these paintings. There is a moment of democratization that occurs when museums themselves develop as a typology. And so, for example, for someone like Schinkel, the museum was one of many examples, including the theater and later the department store, that offered democratic spaces for cultural exchange. And so for him and his design for the Altus Museum in Berlin, it was really important to not just create this kind of neoclassic sort of solid volume in space, but actually to create a building that invited you in. So the way that this procession is sort of described by Schinkel, or sort of paraphrased, I guess, by Schinkel, is that the building invites the city in. First because of the plaza in front of it, but then also the setback of this monumental stair and this kind of inside-outside space. That's really probably the most important space in a way for Schinkel. It's a space that's not programmed with any art, but it's important because this is the moment where you ascend the stairs, you turn back and you look back at the city. So it's an embrace of the city and it's a gift back to the city and its inhabitants. And I think that for Schinkel, alongside the other innovations of classification and organizing archives, this for me is sort of the singular gift that the Altus Museum gives. And it's something that I think presages a lot of what we try to do today in contextualizing museums and the artwork that they hold. Of course, we have a lot of examples of the white boxes, that sort of the standard international style modernist kind of building. I think you all know sort of what that looks like. Maybe a more interesting 20th century example is this one. I think it's more relevant. Lino Bobardi's Sao Paulo Museum of Art from '68. Notice the time frame, '68, very interesting year in politics and social upheaval. Bobardi's response to the Bauhaus international style white box is to do her own glass box, but one that is really situated in a particular specificity of cultural politics in Sao Paulo. And so what she has here is a space for art viewing, but it's also a public space underneath. It's a kind of reconciliation of a global style with an indigenous understanding of what architecture is. It's a grand monumental gesture, this gallery suspended from 240-foot long beams attached to 4 columns. It's levitated. The interior probably looks more kind of Bauhaus than the exterior. It creates a kind of urban room with a view, but what's most important is, I think, what Malraux would probably be really thrilled about was this urban room, which is the staging of the artworks was completely flexible. So in some instances, you can have this completely open. In other instances, you could have it fully populated with paintings and sculptures. And then in other instances, it could be some situation in between. And so this nimbleness, this flexibility that that Bobardi built into a building that doesn't move, the walls don't move, but that creates a kind of an environment that allows for an openness of thinking and exchange of ideas that is not static, but that actually can change with changing conversations in time. There are other buildings where you could argue that, museums where you could argue that the building is even more important than the stuff inside it, which is hard to imagine given, for example, the Guggenheim Museum and the treasures therein. But you could certainly argue that Wright's Guggenheim is one of those, building as work of art. The Anti-Museum, in fact, because Wright thought it was stupid to do a museum. He really didn't want to do a museum. So what he did instead was the Impossible Museum. So if you look at the section of this building, there are no straight walls or level floors. So everything creates a kind of impossibility vis-a-vis the sort of normative way of viewing art. And as somebody who worked in the Guggenheim exhibitions department for a while, I can tell you how difficult it is to hang anything in that space. But in a way, he was sort of making his point very clear, which is that, yes, there's the art, but first it's the building. And let us admire that. You could then extend that to a newer Guggenheim, which has transformed an entire Spanish city. It's the Bilbao Museum. The museum has not only triggered a new economy in Spain, it's also triggered new conversations about what it is to be Basque. And this has been known subsequently as the Bilbao effect. So now, not only does the building stand in for an entire region of a country, it sort of becomes a kind of icon for luxury and art consumption. And so it sort of circulates in this very kind of complicated brew of not always consistent kind of points of view. But it is an icon, and despite the very important works of art inside it, you could argue that this is what we think of when we think of the Guggenheim Bilbao. So in a way, it's sort of unimportant what the inside looks like. It's the gesture of this form that has transformed the urban fabric that's most resonant. I wanted to move to another example, which I think I've spent a little bit more time with, and this is Bernard Tschumi's new Acropolis Museum. And I like it because Tschumi, in his writing, but also in his work and in his better projects, of which this is one of them, I think, ushers in cinematic imaginaries and literary imaginaries. And this is a product of his own sort of intellectual institutional upbringing. And so the story of the museum really does unfold as a kind of narrative. It also, you could argue, reshaped and transformed the city of Athens. It is built in the shadow of the Acropolis Museum. You could argue that the building itself was actually created for stolen sculptures. In other words, it was created and intended for work that the country of Greece does not own anymore. And so, in a sense, then the building itself became a symbol, and the emptiness of it became a symbol for one country's efforts to repatriate their cultural heritage. But this idea again that stolen works of art, that this museum would be dedicated to stolen works of art, is quite something. And as you walk through it, the entry sequence was complicated by the fact that as they were sort of doing the foundations, they realized that there was this whole other archaeological site underneath, and of course it had to be preserved, and it became the new ground, if you will, of the entry sequence to the Acropolis Museum. And there's a lot of emptiness as you go in. There's a lot of reminding us of the voids that Greece is somehow grappling with, and is still grappling with, by the way, today. So the museum is from 2009. As of today, England has not returned, the British Museum has not returned the Elgin marbles. So it still stands as a kind of memory of that absence. But he choreographs it in a really interesting way, because you walk into a kind of this absent space, this hypostyle hall, and the stairs eventually sort of lead you up to this intermediate area and climax at the top, which is a kind of rough floor plan of the Parthenon that then looks back at the Parthenon itself. And what you have here are reproductions and originals. So the reproductions are the white that the British Museum still has, and the originals. And Shumi wanted to sort of put them all there together to amplify, first of all, what it meant that we were no longer looking at the originals, we were looking at reproductions, but that the reproductions were actually the bits, not the originals, that had gathered, that had attracted the thousands and thousands of new visitors to the museum. So one wonders then what happens when and if the Elgins ever return, if the spectatorship to the Acropolis Museum will decline, in fact, rather than go up. But that was an interesting effect that I think even Shumi maybe couldn't have foresawn. The spectacle of the loss, and these ersatz sculptures actually created their own kind of spectacle. So as I said, I think Shumi is someone who leans into the cinematic and the narrative. And that sort of takes me to some of those buildings we looked at before. And again, looking at filmmakers now who represent and represent these buildings anew to us. And I guess the question then for us is, how do we use their interpretations of these buildings or their visions for these buildings as a way to rethink what we perceive as museological space? So here we have Ila Becca and Louise Lemoine's Gary's Vertigo from 2013. So instead of talking about the works of art, the filmmakers focus on the people whose job it is to maintain the buildings. So these are people who had training in mountain climbing specifically, and had to learn how to rappel off of the siding, and every day are in the process of either window cleaning or rubbing off of the, some of the staining and the rusting off of the metal. And so the whole film revolves around their lives. And the spaces that they occupy, spaces that we wouldn't originally actually have any access to, but for the fact that they become the centers of the story rather than the works of art, or in fact, the star architect himself. Another iconic building that has been rethought very provocatively in film is Tom Tykwer's The International, who shoots a, 15-minute shootout scene in Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum. And I was very inspired by this. I thought, well, what if this were an architecture project? And in fact, I did assign it to my students. And I said, okay, in groups of 2, everybody takes a minute of the shootout sequence and you build a model of it. So the idea was that, in fact, the presupposition, which was a good one actually on the part of me, which was that none of the students had actually seen this iconic building in real life. So how do we understand this building through the lens, through the film lens, through the behavior of the camera, through the behavior of these new actors in this stage? So in a combination of a full-size 1-to-1 scale model that was built outside of Berlin, of the interior atrium of the Guggenheim, with in situ filming, Tykwer creates this assemblage, this sequence, this new action sequence, which radically, of course, redefines our understanding of the museum, and in a way also just sort of takes it away from being this precious object, because at the end of the sequence, the glass from the atrium comes crashing down into the lobby as a sort of final hurrah, filmic hurrah. There are other films that have been really interesting that talk about museums. Ron Tal's The Museum looks at the historic museum in Jerusalem, but again, from the perspective of the people who maintain the works of art, and from the curators and installers who take hours and hours of time trying to figure out where to put things and how to stage them. Jem Cohen's Museum Hours from 2013 takes yet another take, which is to sort of take a fictional story of a museum guard in a historic museum in Vienna, and his interactions with a woman who's visiting her ill sister from out of town. How the museum, again, as in the other cases, serves as a kind of central character, but not a character that houses art objects, a character that houses conversations and the intersections of lives and narratives. And I think that that's something that Cohen is really brilliant at doing in this kind of a film. And in all of these examples, the stills themselves, so if we were to imagine these stills as individual photographs of spaces in these museums, offer a lot, I think, of inspiration for reimagining what it is to occupy the space of a gallery. And then there's Alexander Sukhov's Russian Arc of 2012. 2002. Now I had GIFs of this. I was going to do the whole like clip thing, and I realized yesterday that my computer upload speed is not fast enough. So we're just going to stick to stills, right, Alan? So Cyclops film. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it is shot in the Hermitage Museum, and it is the story of 300 years of Russian history told through the lens of one single shot done in one take. So the shot is over 90 minutes long, and it's one take. So it's really a revolutionary kind of piece of filmmaking, but what it does is it creates a kind of this fictional, unbroken line of a portrayal of a history that's anything but unbroken, that's full of controversy, that's full of death and chaos and despair, and it creates this alternative story. And so you have these 400 actors making their way into this building that we are sort of taken into by these muses. And we go into the ballroom, we visit the Romanovs, and by the end of the story, we have sort of seen the arc of Russia's glorious history and tragic, more recent present. So again, using film as a way to kind of rethink not just kind of the spaces of the museum, but how to tell the story of history itself through a moving image. And that brings me to a Mexican film, Museo. Tell me how much time I have, because I know we went over.
That's okay. We still have 20 minutes.
Okay. So Museo, which is a film by Alonso Ruiz Palacios, it tells the story of this kid who grows up in the shadow of Barragan's satellite sculptures, which are these. And he grows up with a disdain for history. So what does he do? He decides that when he grows up, he's going to get a summer job at the Museo Nacional Antropológico in Mexico City. Here is the museum. It's from 1963 by Pedro Vázquez. And he decides he's going to take a summer job and catalog visually every piece, every artifact in the museum for their archives. And so he thought at first that this was a real absurdity to have this sort of catalog of photographs. Why would you need them if you have the specimens themselves? But the film also takes on a sequence of kind of still shots in this moment. And then that gets replicated in the famous heist scene. So the story is of this heist, this art heist, and it's based sort of on a true story. And so when they decide to sort of do this heist, they walk over a kind of maquette of a Mayan city. And here they are when they enter the plaza. And as they get to the works of art, they bring out their very rudimentary, non-digital, non-sophisticated tools for breaking into some of the most precious works of art. And instead of showing this as an action sequence, it's actually shown as a series of stills. So the hammer doesn't move, the screws don't move, the scissors don't move, but what we see essentially is a series of snapshots that lead to this, a series of empty cases. The film is obviously much more than that, but the climax of the scene is when they realize they need a bathroom break after they've made their escape. And so how do they celebrate? They celebrate by taking a bathroom break at Barragan's Torres de Satellite in Mexico City. Now what? Well, now we celebrate. And so that's sort of the end of the sequence. I bring this movie up, not because of so much the plot, but sort of how the beginning sort of then ends up at the end, which is that the character returns to the museum, realizes that the heist is a complete failure, checks in all the works of art at the garde-robe. So at the coat check, he drops off all the works of art because he realizes he can never sell them. But what he's most amazed by is that walking back through the museum gallery spaces, that they're busier than they've ever been before. And that since the scandal of the heist and since the work was stolen, this became the spectacle. So these empty cases with their empty displays, you know, became the subject of fascination for this new generation of museum goers. And that, I think, is an interesting message for us to sort of think about. Absence and loss, reproductions, facsimiles, originals, and not, and what does it mean for artifacts to be stolen only to then turn around and have the building that was made to house them become more infamous than ever before. I told you I was going to return to the Museum of Natural History. Here it is in Night at the Museum. Night at the Museum was actually based on, was actually based on a children's book. The Night at the Museum was written by Milan Trench in 1993. I think it's not accidental that kids' books factor in here, because kids tap into an imaginary that we adults seem to forget about. And so I think looking at children's books actually might be kind of instructional. So it's understandable that this would actually have its inspiration from this museum. But basically the plot is, as you would imagine, everybody goes to bed, the museum goes to sleep. You think everybody's quiet, but what do they do after we go away? Well, this is what they do after we go away. Everything comes to life, and this poor night guard, you know, has found a new kind of series of adventures for himself. One that he thought he wouldn't have to sort of, he thought he was going to get a boring job, and it became anything but boring. Another story that I think is really interesting is the Mixed Up Files of Basil Frankweiler. It's another kid's book. This one takes place in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it centers on the story of Claudia and her brother. The first paragraph of the book is as follows, and I'll just read it really quickly. She knew that she'd never be able to pull off the old-fashioned kind of running away. So this is not a museum heist story, this is a runaway story. That is running away in the heat of anger with a knapsack on her back. She didn't like discomfort, even picnics were untidy and inconvenient, all those insects and the sun melting, the icing and the cupcakes. Therefore, she decided that her leaving home would not be just running from somewhere, but be running to somewhere, a large place, a comfortable place, keep in mind Catcher of the Rye, if you will, an indoor place, a preferably beautiful place, and that's why she decided upon the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And so in the book, when you read the kids' book, in the middle of the book is the floor plans of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And as we read it, we find out a little bit of a sort of a clue, a story, let's say, to make themselves less obvious as new inhabitants of the museum. They scatter their belongings throughout the floor plan. So the violin case of her brother's was hidden in a sarcophagus, in a beautifully carved Roman sarcophagus. She hid her book bag behind a tapestry screen in the rooms of French furniture. Her brother wanted to hide his things in a mummy case, but Claudia said, no, that's too far. The Egyptian art space is way too far from their bedroom. Too many risks involved. It might as well be Egypt. So instead, the trumpet case was hidden inside a large urn, and the book bag was neatly tucked behind a drape behind a statue from the Middle Ages. And then the two, this is where the, yeah. And then there was the two major spaces, their sleeping space, which is a canopy bed that doesn't exist anymore, and where they would take their baths, which was the fountain that no longer exists that used to be in the restaurant of the Met. And so there's this kind of drawing that takes place, very crude, very quickly done by yours truly, this kind of alternative map of life in the Metropolitan Museum from the vantage point of two kids sleeping there over the course of a week. Incidentally, and this is for Elena, because she's Italian, and you know, this is a fantastic project. In addition to their life in the floor plan of the Met, which is again sort of gets restricted to these sort of moments and zigzagging between them, they also have to go find food at the automat and, you know, do a few other things. They decide they want to send a letter to the curators. Well, they could do that if they go to the Olivetti store on Fifth Avenue, which was designed by BBPR Architects, this famous firm from Milano, with interiors given to us by Constantino Nivola. The typewriter used to exist on Fifth Avenue with paper in it. So they walked over to the typewriter, they wrote a letter to the curators about their favorite object, and in the mat and whether it was indeed from Michelangelo. So it's interesting that this project was chosen because the Olivetti is a kind of showroom. It's a micro museum of the history of Olivetti, the company, as well as a kind of retail space. So these sort of different realms kind of come together to create this space of consumption and sort of memory making. So I just wanted to end, since sort of talking about films, with this notion of a mise en scène, because I think mise en scène is also something that lends itself to thinking about museums. It literally comes from the 18th century, from the French, to literally put on stage. And its 19th century valences come from theater, regarding staging of plays, the scenery, properties of stage production, the stage setting. And then later on in the 19th century, it actually talks about the surroundings themselves, the backgrounds of events and actions. So now we're talking about the proscenium becoming part of the story. And then the 20th century cinematography enters the conversation, and now mise en scène takes on the design and composition of elements visible on a screen, including the setting, costumes, action, lighting, etc. So what I want to leave you with is maybe number 4, which you might want to add to the virtual Oxford English Dictionary for 2020, is in museology, what does mise en scène mean in the context of graduate thesis, SCI-Arc, and the Musée Imaginaire? How do we extend Malraux's Imaginaire to understand it as a performative concept, as a concept of post, or virtual, or a-typological? Any of these could be, in a way, kind of interchangeable notions of this new museum. An exhibition venue where curation is front-loaded, displays become immersive, environmental, programming privileges experience of the viewer as consumer. And this is where trafficking comes in. It's a provocation on my part, but I really use it here in the context of museum building and museum making as a tactic of exchange, the dealing in and trading of objects and images, where objects are invested with multiple meanings, introducing the possibility of various interpretations and viewpoints. Sorry, typo. That's it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for the phenomenal lecture. And I would like to ask our students if they have questions or something to add or to ask. I mean, I know all of you are now home and you're thinking about what happens with your pinups, since they're not pinups anymore. And the idea of having this conversation about the museum, the empty museum, is to understand that museums are, in fact, places of many occurrences, many of which are not actually tied to the existence of the physical existence and location of such. And so this was in a way to inspire the students to think beyond the literality of the exhibition space. We usually have, miniature and midterm are important deadlines where the exhibition of the work happens physically in school. And so Jasmine, we're still going to do them, but it's going to be an empty museum. Clearly, it's going to be an empty school with the whole work in display. And also part of this is what happens when the audience is mediated by something else, which is a screen, a lens, a camera, a video, etc. And so I'm hoping that maybe we want to close the shared content, and so we can see the students. I just want to see the, yeah, okay. So maybe then you guys, I don't have to unmute you. You can unmute yourself, can you?
Yeah,
Okay, great.
I have for Jasmine. Hi, I'm Vincent. I really, I want to know more about the class activity that you had the students do, like building a model of the Guggenheim from the camera, or like from a minute of the scene. What was the result, or like any lessons from that like assignment?
I don't see Jasmine.
Is Jasmine here? Oh no, I can ask again when she comes back.
Okay, let me.
I see her spot, but I don't see her. Maybe she can hear us.
Let me text her. Let me call her. I don't know. Maybe we have
I'm sending it, yeah, the chat, but
Christina, I thought it was really relevant for your project since you're talking about a museum.
Yeah, I love a really on point lecture. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about, I think, all of the students' work. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is like an important moment to kind of reconsider how thesis is being presented generally. And so some sort of the thought of some spatial translation into the digital form and how we might present our work in a way that maybe evokes some of the kind of memory that Jasmine was talking about, some of those writers were talking about. You have this kind of like idea. I have a friend who like works at the Met who is talking about, well, you can just like go to the room and you know what's in the room and you can think about it like that. How there's some sort of maybe translation of like that kind of collection of student work together into a room, how you might do that.
Mm-hmm. Like, can there be like the monumentality, like the idea of like a space that's fixed and like it's calming, you know, to us? Like, how is that replicated online? Is there like, is it calming to be like because like the scalar issue doesn't really exist online, right?
Bene, so I texted Jasmine, I'm not sure. She hasn't answered me. So maybe it's technical difficulties. Yeah, I think it's relevant also not only to people that have museums. I thought it's also to understand why Florence and I are still thinking to have pieces in the school, because we think actually there is a value in understanding and seeing them through a different lens. And also for us to understand that, yes, spaces can be cannibalized in different ways, and they have been before in many formats and ways. And imaginations truly is not linked to a physical location. And so, yes, the lack of that physical location is an issue, but truly that also triggers a set of new possibilities. So Benjamin, Jasmine is back. So there is a question for you.
My computer crashed, so now I have to run down and use my laptop. So the virtual background has gone away.
Okay, that's okay. That's your house. You have like, do you really have a, is that your house?
Yes, it is my house.
Love it. Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries. I wanted to know what the results and any lessons from the exercise of picking like a minute from that movie and asking to design a model of it. Like, what were the results?
Well, what was really interesting was that you realized how much we rely on photographs. And especially in studio, all our precedents. I mean, what percentage of the precedents that you study in school have you actually visited in real life? You know, right. Well, in the case of my studio, nobody had been to the Guggenheim. So it was an exercise in radical alienation in a way, right? So you had to remove yourself from any kind of preconception of what the space was based on documentary photographs of it. And so in fact, it was a kind of creative process of recreating and representing a new Guggenheim. So the 1 minute sequences of models were then placed next to each other, and all 8 of them, I think there was 8 of them, then became the new section and plan of the Guggenheim Museum. And so you could imagine that you could use any film and any sequence, didn't have to be a shootout sequence, but any kind of film experience that captures the Guggenheim, and you would come up with a different set of models. And then they were to do drawings of the models. So then the drawings then became sort of new, floor plans for engagement, right? So that became the new museum.
Was there like a strategy that they used to create form from those images? Was it?
Yeah, mostly? I mean, we talked about essentially. First of all, they were limited to glue and paper. So that's all they had. So they were paper models, exquisitely detailed, but you know, the task was to somehow figure out a way architecturally and spatially and formally index movement. So you're indexing the behavior of the camera, but then you're also trying to find a way to index the action that takes place within the frame. And so how you toggle between, how the models toggle between those two positions, the position of the camera and the position of the action in the screen, was what was the sort of the major driver of the. I can send Elena some pictures of models if you want to see them.
Yeah, I would love to see that.
Yeah, I mean, it was, again, it was a real moment. I talk about it as an exercise of radical alienation from the icon. Yeah. Which I think in a way all of you have to do when you're looking at the precedents, right? Is to, first of all, yes, you learn them, but then you, whatever you learn, you kind of throw away. You know, you put it to one side and you try to relearn with new tools and new perspective.
Because I'm thinking that you could even, you know, through Zoom, now that our presentations are through Zoom, you can build something like that, like a model like that, and like physically just move the model around, you know, and then that would be like a way of showing people the space that's not like a perspective render. It would be a physical model that you can move, and, you know, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and if you think about Museo, the film that I talked about, another way to think about it just through photographs is that the programming happens through a staging of a series of stills, right? So these stills could be stills of models, they could be stills of animations, and then how they're negotiated in time and space creates a kind of new framework for understanding curation.
So how do you think memory and imaginations are connected? In what way? I'm thinking of the sentence that you cannot imagine anything you don't know. You know, maybe you cannot imagine anything you don't slightly remember and somehow made a mess of.
Well, I think some of the, what I liked about some of those New Yorker articles was that these art critics were really struggling with their memories. For some reason they had sort of, it's like you take your memory for granted when you don't have to worry about whether you'll ever see Las Meninas again. But then when there's a moment when you think you may never see it again, you really try to reconstruct your memory more carefully. And the more you try to reconstruct it, the more anxiety provoking it is. But then I think you can use that anxiety as a space to open up the imaginary. You know, that's where the imagination can come in those gaps where, you know, those, instead of being anxious about forgetting a detail or not being able to recuperate one, this is where the imaginary comes in and intervenes.
Hi, Jasmine, this is Sadvi.
Hi, Sadvi.
Question. Hi. Great lecture. Thank you so much for that. I'm particularly interested in the Acropolis Museum by Bernard Schumi. And if you could talk a little bit about why there are replicas and originals in the same building, and why the replicas attracted more interest in viewers and what that means.
Right, so like the empty cases in Museo, which saw record attendance in Mexico City. I think Schumi's initial, I mean, obviously there are other objects in the museum that fill the Acropolis Museum, but the initial mandate or the initial brief for the Acropolis Museum was to create a building so that that stuff that was stolen would come back. In other words, if you create a building that's important enough and dedicated to stolen heritage, maybe you'll have a chance of actually then getting that heritage back. He had initially thought about just leaving what was missing or what was stolen as a void, but he decided not to do that. He decided to actually put white plaster reproductions, and it's very clear when you're in the space which ones are the reproductions and which are not, because they're very white, they're pristine. And so and the fascination that the viewers, and I was sort of looking around at people that were looking at the work with me, and the fascination that they had towards those ghosts, if you will, right? The spectral white reproductions of what should be there, but what wasn't. The level of interest in those was by far exceeded anything else. Yeah. But there's a lot of, there's a lot of plays of solid and void throughout the programming of the volumes. You could say, in a way, the building is an incredibly inefficient housing of objects because there's a lot of empty space. But, that was kind of intentional because especially the scale of the monumental stair, and that volume that took you from the ground up to this moment where you have this sort of mirroring of the Parthenon because you turn around and you see the Parthenon actually. And then you're looking at the space and there's this toggling back and forth. So I think he was thinking of absence as a literal void, but he was also thinking of it in the context of these replicas, creating their own kind of interest.
Right. And the replicas were very clearly distinguishable as replicas, and they did not try to mimic the actual materials or like the stones, and they looked like replicas on purpose.
Yeah, no, they're plaster replicas, and they're impossible. They're impossible in their whiteness, right? So they're too pristine to be ever, confused with the actual historical artifacts that are authentic there. Mm-hmm. And their shininess and their newness really is kind of, when you're in that space, is really glaringly obvious. And then there are other pieces that have totally been lost. So there are moments where the walls are blank, where there are pieces in the narrative that are completely missing, that have not been recuperated at all. Mm-hmm. And there he chose to just sort of leave a blank and not, put a drawing or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add something because maybe some of my students heard my lecture about the expectation of classical antiquity to be white, and the reason for which the marble in I don't know if you know the story, but basically at some point, one of the donor of the British Museum, the one that paid actually for the gallery where the original statues are, asked the director of the museum to clean them. And they actually scrape away the whole surface of the marble because he expected that they would be white. In an expectation, it needed to be pristine and white. And in reality, this artifact, the original artifacts, are not. And so you can even still go. I mean, I was in London last summer, and I looked at them, and you can
the British Museum. Yeah,
you can tell exactly when it's clean and scraped, and the part that is actually not. So the expectation of those artifacts to be the one we understand historically to be pristine and white is so strong that this story is telling the fact that, even just in terms of preservation, this is not like happened a million years ago, happened 50 years ago, that a museum, the owner of the museum would allow a donor in imagination of whiteness to be executed on pieces of that importance to be cleaned. So anyway, so that's just to tell you that the copy is closer to the idea of the original than the original. That's the thing, that the expectation of the audience is much more closer to that.
And I think if you're interested in that Mark Wigley's book, White Walls, White Dresses, is really fantastic. Sort of exploring the idea of whiteness in classical architecture and art, but also, in a newer sort of context of understanding it. It's funny because in the film Museo, one of the reasons the title character ends up having to return the artifacts and drop them off at the coat check is because the guy he tried to sell them to, he realized, was from the British Museum. And so he was totally offended by that and thought there's no way that Mexican heritage is going to end up in the hands of the British. And so it's a reference to the Elgin marbles and the sort of the pillaging of the colonial pillaging of antiquity. In Mexico, it's a little bit different because it's the history of Mexico. It's the colonization is not as explicit, but nonetheless, it is a kind of colonization of Mayan history that gets housed in this museum. So that's sort of the initial critique.
Any other question from the audience? Okay, so Jasmine,
sorry, I wanted
yeah,
to
right.
say a final. Thank you, Jasmine. That was amazing, and I think that when you were off, when we lost you, we had the students had a small conversation.
Well, what did you talk about? I want to know.
We thought no bad about you. No, I'm joking.
No. What were you talking about?
So they were talking. I think Christina was talking about, how we're planning, or what is the role of a presentation today. So in terms of not only about social distancing, social change. I think there are a lot of things that are happening now and that might made us rethink how we show the work. So I think that in a way that, I was happy how you went old world, new world. You show a little bit of what is the role, how museums actually started in the old world, and then how we're heavily challenged in the new world, in Brazil and Mexico. So I think it's, it opens the view. Also countries that were colonial countries. So the kind of colonialism of the role of the museum is challenged, even though they're really heavy in the sense of the inheritance that they received from their original, conquerors, let's say, for Mexico and Brazil, both of them. And also for, I would say that in the case, we have a Brazilian here over there, Giovanna. So, and also I think in the case of, the museum, the museum role in Lina Bobardi, the role of modern, the modern movement in South America. I think it's interesting. So I just wanted to make that, and for Mexico, both examples, it's international style. For Brazil and Mexico, it's quite unique adaptation that they have. Lina Bobardi, I think, is very unique, but also the anthropology, Museo Antropológico is So I think that I like how your thesis really tries to unravel a more complex situation for that.
Yeah, and I think also in this dynamic. Sorry, I just want to say in this dynamic under this sort of rubric of trafficking, it was important for me actually not to show any of those white boxes. In other words, the normative sort of 20th century museum condition that the Bauhaus so leaned heavily on, right? So the curatorial, everybody, I wanted to resist sort of even putting a picture of it. First of all, I assumed everybody knows what those museums look like. But also in a way just to resist it by saying, let's not look at those at all anymore. Let's try to kind of, and my MO is always looking at others, artists, art critics, filmmakers in particular, photographers. What can they tell us about these spaces that we just didn't realize or just didn't occur to us because we come from our own sort of institutional biases. And so I think it's always very useful to pick up a children's book once in a while and watch a film. Museo is fantastic. I highly recommend it. As the Jem Cohen book, one, Gary's Vertigo, all of those are really, really fantastic. Rethinking and really, for a historian like myself, really destabilizing my preconceptions of what these buildings stood for and what they meant, and how, in fact, like the studio project that I suggested at the Guggenheim, it provoked me to kind of totally rethink and re-narrate and retell the story of the buildings.
I think it was an inspiring lecture. I think because you didn't give us a formula to what will have to be our version of this, but I think you gave us an example of all these tangentials that are around the Ottawa Museum and how trafficking really happens in our mind, in our imagination. And I think these examples are gonna hopefully free the students to think of this as an opportunity rather than only a limitation. So thank you for your time.
And you've recorded it, right?
I did.
You've recorded it.
Yes.
So they can go back and look at my last slide, my proposed definition for you of the new Musée Imaginaire, and see what you do with it. Yeah.
Okay.
See
fantastic.
what you do with it.
I have a print screen, so I can share it on email of your final page. So
this was great.
The post virtual pseudo A. Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Good.
Thank you so much.
And
Thank
also,
you
it'd be
so
wonderful
much.
you'll join us in review. So you guys, you probably are going to see Jasmine again at your reviews.
Yeah.